The wind howled as I drove through the pitch-black highway. It had been hours since I'd left my friend's place, heading back home from a small trip. The night was dead quiet, aside from the occasional distant rumble of thunder. I didn't plan on stopping for gas, but the dashboard light blinked on in warning. "Fuel low," it said in a cold, indifferent voice. I sighed, my eyes scanning the empty stretch of road for anything that resembled a gas station. Nothing but an endless line of trees on both sides of me, their branches shaking with the wind. Finally, I saw the dim glow of a single light ahead, breaking through the darkness like a beacon. A small gas station stood alone at the edge of the highway, an isolated oasis in a sea of nothingness. Pulling into the lot, I took a look around. The station wasn't exactly comforting, barely lit, its windows cracked and dirty, and a faded open sign hanging loosely in the window. The place didn't look like it had seen many visitors in a while. Were limited. I parked by the nearest pump and got out. The cold wind cut through my jacket. It was strange that such a small, isolated station would be open at this hour, but I didn't have time to wonder too much about it. The gas tank light blinked again, pushing me to act quickly. As I walked to the pump, I noticed how unnervingly quiet it was. No sound at all, not even the usual hum of the streetlights or the distant sounds of cars speeding by. It felt like the world had fallen silent around this place. I grabbed the nozzle and began filling up the car. That's when I heard it, a soft sound coming from inside the small convenience store attached to the gas station. It was like whispering, low murmurs of voices that I couldn't quite make out. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stopped pumping gas and glanced toward the door, trying to see if anyone was there. For a moment, nothing happened. The voices stopped, and all I could hear was the sound of the gas pumping, mingling with the occasional groan of the wind. My eyes stayed on the dark, cracked windows of the station, waiting to see any sign of movement, but nothing came. I quickly finished filling up and returned the nozzle to its place, more relieved than I wanted to admit. Just as I was about to jump back into my car and drive off, the door to the store creaked open. A figure stepped out. At first, I thought it might be the gas station attendant, though I hadn't seen one when I pulled in. The person was wearing a heavy old jacket, its hood pulled over their head so their face was obscured in the shadows. Their slow, shuffling steps sounded like they were dragging against the ground, like each foot was weighed down by something. My curiosity overcame me, but I hesitated for a second too long. They were approaching the gas pump where I stood, their steps slow and deliberate. "Excuse me, do you need help?" I asked, my voice sounding louder in the sudden silence than I intended. It felt almost awkward to speak, like the air around us had thickened. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they stopped about a foot away from me and stood there without moving, as if they were just staring at me beneath their hood. A creeping chill ran down my spine, and I stepped back. I didn't know why, but my gut told me something wasn't right. My hand instinctively went to the door of my car, ready to get back in if needed. Then, the figure muttered something, almost inaudible at first, but the more they spoke, the clearer it became. "You shouldn't be here. You should leave," they whispered, their voice raspy, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. I froze. That wasn't exactly the sort of greeting you expect from someone who works at a gas station, and certainly not at 2 in the morning. I'm just filling up, then I'll be on my way," I said, my heart beginning to race. But they didn't move. They just stood there, staring at me from the shadows. And that's when I noticed it. There was something off about them, something wrong. The way they stood, motionless, but with an air of familiarity, like they'd seen me before, even if I was sure I'd never met them. I forced myself to look away and back at my car. That's when I realized something else. The gas tank was full, but I knew I hadn't finished filling it up yet. I stared at the nozzle in my hand, bewildered, trying to process what had just happened. My thoughts scrambled. I hadn't clicked the pump off. I hadn't even gotten back in the car yet. The figure finally spoke again, this time softer, more insistent. "Leave now. Don't look back." I quickly got into the car and slammed the door shut. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared out through the windshield at the figure still standing in front of the pump. I put the car in drive, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. But I couldn't help it. I glanced back at the figure. Their face was still obscured by their hood, but something in me felt compelled to look, just a glimpse. When my eyes met theirs, my blood ran cold. The person's eyes, or whatever they were, stared back, their pupils a deep, unnatural shade of black. A jolt of fear shot through me, and I stepped on the gas. Tires screeched against the cracked asphalt as I sped away from the station. For the next few miles, I drove faster than I'd ever driven before, my eyes nervously flicking to the rearview mirror. I wasn't sure what I had seen, but my instincts told me that I shouldn't have been there. As I looked back through the mirror, I thought I saw the faint glow of the gas station's lights behind me. But when I turned around to look, nothing was there. The darkness had swallowed it all. I kept driving, faster and faster, feeling the uneasy knot in my stomach tighten with every mile I put between myself and the gas station. The night had returned to its eerie silence, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. I glanced over at the empty road, barely illuminated by my headlights. A wave of unease washed over me. Could it have been a prank? No, it didn't feel like that. It felt real, too real. After a few more minutes of driving, I started to feel slightly more at ease, like the suffocating weight in the air was finally starting to lift. Maybe it was just the strangeness of being alone on the road so late, the exhaustion setting in. But then I noticed it. My rearview mirror was shaking ever so slightly, as if vibrating, making my heartbeat quicken. I squinted, wondering why it was moving on its own. Slowly, I dared a glance into the reflection, hoping it was just my imagination playing tricks. There it was again. The shadow, a dark figure, much smaller than before, flickering briefly in the corner of the mirror. I slammed my foot on the brakes. The car jolted to a stop in the middle of the empty road. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. I told myself it was just my mind running wild, the late hour making me paranoid. I wiped the sweat from my palms and turned my head. Nothing was there. The road was empty, just the stretch of highway in front of me, bathed in the yellow glow of my headlights. I started the car again, still shaken but trying to steady myself. I told myself I was safe. I had left. The station was far behind, but every instinct in my body screamed that I was wrong. My fingers tightened around the wheel as I sped up again, desperate to get as far away from that place as possible. For the next 20 minutes, the tension barely left my shoulders. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching on, until I finally saw something that made my heart leap in my chest. A sign for a small town up ahead. A gas station sign. But as I approached, I realized something strange again. The closer I got, the more I could see the faint glow of lights in the distance. I passed a few homes, their windows dim, but the deeper I drove, the fewer signs of life there seemed to be. The lights were out. It was only when I finally passed a large abandoned structure, its weather-beaten walls creeping with overgrowth, that I froze again. There was no gas station. It wasn't the one I thought I'd seen, it was the same exact gas station I'd stopped at. I slammed on the brakes. The car jerked to a stop, nearly sending me into the shoulder of the road. I blinked, my eyes adjusting. The building, exactly the same as the one I had just left behind, sat now in front of me, faintly glowing under a sickly street lamp. The windows were cracked, the open sign still flickered with that same dull, haunting light. I looked around, my hands shaking. The sign leading into the town clearly read, 3 miles to Cedarbrook. I had driven well over an hour from the gas station and was certain there was no turning back, no other road to reach this place. But the gas station, it wasn't supposed to be here. My breath caught in my throat. I turned the car around almost too quickly. I pushed the gas pedal harder, desperate to leave, to move away from whatever horror that place was trapping me in. But despite the full tank of gas, despite the miles I'd just driven, the road stretched on. It never changed. The houses around me stayed dark. The wind howled like something angry in the distance. And yet, I knew, deep in my chest, that nothing I did would take me out of this loop. I glanced into the rearview mirror one final time. The figure had returned, closer this time, their dark hood low over their face. The wind howled. I could feel their eyes burning into the back of my skull. Suddenly, I realized I had forgotten to check the fuel gauge. It was flashing red again. It was late at night, and I was driving down a desolate highway. The moonlight struggled to break through the thick clouds, leaving the road dim and unwelcoming. I had been driving for hours, and my eyelids felt heavier with every passing mile. The fuel gauge was blinking, almost empty. I knew I couldn't make it much farther. Up ahead, I spotted a flickering sign that read, Sam's Gas and Mart. The light was weak, and some of the letters were burned out, but I didn't care. It was the only sign of civilization I'd seen in miles. As I pulled into the lot, the crunch of gravel under my tires echoed into the emptiness. The station was old, with peeling paint and a crooked roof. A single dim bulb hung above the pumps, casting long, eerie shadows. I parked my car and stepped out. The air was colder than I expected, and a strange smell lingered, like something metallic mixed with decay. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the flickering light. I glanced around. There were no other cars, no signs of anyone inside the store, yet the door was slightly ajar, creaking as the wind nudged it. "Hello?" I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the darkness. No answer. I hesitated, but I needed gas. I swiped my card at the pump, but the machine displayed an error message, "See cashier." Annoyed, I walked toward the store. The glass door was smeared with grime, and as I pushed it open, a small bell jingled faintly. The inside was worse than the outside, dimly lit with shelves half-stocked and covered in dust. The coolers hummed loudly, their glass fogged and cracked. "Hello?" I called again. Still nothing. The counter was empty, but a small note sat on the register. "Back in 5 minutes." I sighed and leaned against the counter, glancing around. That's when I noticed the photos. Behind the counter, a corkboard displayed dozens of faded Polaroids. Each photo showed people standing in front of the gas station, smiling families, tired truckers, and lone travelers like me. But something felt off. I leaned in closer. In every photo, the people were holding up a sign that read, "Last stop." The air grew colder. A shiver ran down my spine, and I backed away from the counter. Just then, the lights flickered, and I heard a faint sound, like footsteps shuffling from the back room. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaking. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I turned toward the door, ready to leave, but a soft voice spoke from the shadows. "Looking for gas?" I spun around. A man had appeared behind the counter. His face was pale, his eyes sunken. He wore a faded uniform with the name tag Sam. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Yeah," I stammered. "Pump's not working." He nodded slowly. "That happens. Old system. I'll fix it." He didn't move, just stared at me. The silence stretched on, and I felt a lump form in my throat. Finally, he reached under the counter and pressed a button. "Try it now," he said. I nodded and hurried outside, grateful to leave the suffocating atmosphere of the store. The pump beeped, and I started fueling up, watching the shadows stretch across the lot. That's when I noticed something strange. On the pump, there was a small sticker. It looked old and worn, but I could still read it. "Beware of the attendant." My heart raced. I glanced back at the store. Through the grimy window, I could see Sam standing there, watching me. His face was still, his expression unreadable. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. I yanked the nozzle out and jumped into my car, heart pounding. As I turned the key, the engine sputtered but wouldn't start. "Come on," I whispered, twisting the key again. Life, and I slammed the car into gear, speeding out of the lot. But as I drove away, something felt wrong. The smell of gasoline was overpowering, and I noticed the fuel gauge. It was still on empty. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and my blood turned cold. Sam was standing in the middle of the road, directly behind me, his pale face illuminated by my taillights. I pressed the accelerator, desperate to get away, but the car suddenly stalled. The lights went out, leaving me in complete darkness. I fumbled with the ignition, but before I could turn the key, I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from behind. "Just needed gas, huh?" Sam's voice came, low and guttural, from just outside the window. I didn't dare turn my head. My fingers trembled as I tried to unlock my phone, but the screen stayed black. A cold hand touched my shoulder, and everything went silent. When I woke up, I was lying in the middle of the empty highway. My car was gone, and so was the gas station. I stumbled to my feet, disoriented. The only thing left behind was a Polaroid photo lying on the asphalt. It was me, standing in front of the gas station, holding a sign that read, "Last Stop." I stood frozen, staring at the photograph in my hand. My face stared back at me in the Polaroid, my expression hauntingly blank. I didn't even remember taking the photo. My heart hammered in my chest, and my hands trembled as I turned the picture over. There was something written on the back, scrawled in messy handwriting. "You can't escape. We'll see you soon." A cold dread settled over me. I spun around, searching for any sign of the gas station or my car, but there was nothing, just an empty stretch of road in both directions, disappearing into the dark horizon. My breathing was shallow as I clutched the photo, trying to make sense of what had happened. "Maybe I'm dreaming," I mumbled. But the pain in my legs and the frostbite like chill on my fingers told me this was all too real. The silence was suffocating. Even the crickets and distant howls of coyotes were missing. I decided to walk. Staying there seemed worse than moving. I stuffed the Polaroid into my pocket and started trudging along the road. The darkness felt alive, shifting and closing in around me. Every now and then, I swore I could hear faint whispers. They sounded like they came from the road itself, carried on the wind. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they filled me with dread. Then about a mile ahead, I saw something. My chest tightened. It was headlights, motionless and pointed toward me. Relief rushed over me. A car, maybe someone who could help. "Hey!" I shouted, breaking into a jog toward the lights. As I got closer, the scene became clearer. It wasn't a car moving toward me. It was my car, sitting dead in the middle of the road, lights on and the driver's side door ajar. My hope turned to confusion and fear as I approached. How had it gotten here? The gas station attendant's words echoed in my mind. "You can't escape." I circled the car slowly, hesitant to get in. The front windshield was cracked, spiderweb-like fractures spreading out from the center. Inside, the seats were slashed open, stuffing spilling out in tufts. My backpack and other belongings were gone. As I peered into the car, something caught my eye, a small leather-bound journal lying on the passenger seat. It definitely wasn't mine. Curiosity and fear fought for control, but I reached in and grabbed the book. The cover was scratched, and the pages were yellowed and brittle. The journal's first entry had large, hurried handwriting that sent shivers down my spine. "If you're reading this, you're already trapped. The only way out is to play the game." I slammed the book shut, panic rising in my chest. What game? I didn't want to know, but deep down, I felt like I had no choice. In that moment, I heard it, a soft creak, like rusty hinges. My head snapped up, and I saw the impossible. The gas station, now standing tall, its lights glowing faintly in the distance behind me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the journal. I hadn't seen it seconds ago, but it was there now, eerily alive like it had followed me. The Polaroid in my pocket grew unnaturally warm, almost burning against my skin. I yanked it out and looked again. The image had changed. Now the photo showed me standing outside the gas station holding the same leather journal. "You have to go back," I whispered to myself. "This is part of the game." With every nerve in my body screaming to run the other way, I turned toward the glowing sign and took slow steps forward. My body felt heavy, like I was wading through thick mud. The gas station loomed larger with each step until I stood once more in front of the rusted door. The sign above flickered, sparks crackling in the frigid air. This time, the letters spelled out something new, no more stops. I stepped inside. The interior had changed too. It was cleaner now, the shelves stocked neatly, though everything was just as quiet and wrong as before. The photos on the corkboard had multiplied, rows of unfamiliar faces pinned up in uniform lines. My own face was no longer there. The journal trembled in my hands, and when I opened it again, the words had shifted. "You're getting closer, Emily. Sam's watching." My blood ran cold at the mention of my name. I hadn't told anyone my name. "Sam," I whispered, spinning around. The store was empty, but I felt the suffocating weight of someone watching. The hum of the coolers grew louder, morphing into a deep, guttural growl. A shadow moved at the edge of my vision, and the lights began flickering erratically. I turned toward the counter, and there he was. Sam stood silently, his pale face warped into an unnatural smile. This time, he wasn't alone. Shadows writhed around him, their vague human-like forms shifting and merging into darkness. "You're late," he said, his voice sounding less human with every syllable. "I just want to leave," I choked out, clutching the journal. He tilted his head. "That's not how this works." The shadows surged toward me, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was Sam's outstretched hand and his crooked smile. I woke up again, lying on the cold asphalt. The gas station was gone, replaced by an empty road and the faint pink glow of sunrise in the distance. In my hand was the Polaroid, unchanged this time. My car was gone, and so was the journal. As I stared at the endless road ahead, I realized the whispers had stopped. For now. But deep down I knew it wasn't over. They were still watching, waiting for my next move. I sat on the empty highway, my mind racing and body trembling. The silence around me felt like a noose tightening with every passing second. I clutched the Polaroid in my hand, unable to tear my eyes away from it. My image stared back at me, unchanging, yet haunting in its simplicity. I stood slowly, scanning the horizon. The faint glow of dawn painted the sky in soft hues, but instead of comforting me, it felt wrong, like it didn't belong here. My only choice was to start walking again, so I did, my feet dragging against the worn asphalt. The more I walked, the more it felt like I wasn't making any progress. The road seemed endless, and the faint shimmer of light on the horizon never came closer. My throat was dry, my body aching, but stopping felt impossible. A subtle pressure seemed to push me forward, like unseen hands guiding me to something unknown. Hours, or maybe minutes, passed before I saw something up ahead. My heart sank as I recognized the shape. It was my car again, sitting idly in the middle of the road, headlights off this time. A familiar dread crept over me, freezing me in my tracks. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. This had to be some sort of loop, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But no matter how much I willed myself to turn back, my legs carried me forward, step by reluctant step. The car was exactly as I'd left it earlier, windshield cracked, seats shredded, and my backpack missing. The door on the driver's side hung open, rocking gently in the faint breeze, but this time, something new was waiting for me inside. On the dashboard was a key and a folded piece of paper. I leaned in carefully, expecting something or someone to jump out at me. When nothing happened, I grabbed the key and opened the note. The handwriting was the same as in the journal, frantic and uneven. "You can run, but you'll only find more doors. Use the key. It's the only way out." I looked around nervously, half expecting Sam to appear again, his hollow eyes and sinister smile greeting me from the darkness. But the road was empty. Only the wind carried on, whispering unintelligible words that sent shivers down my spine. The key was unremarkable, small, brass, and old. I couldn't understand how it could possibly lead to anything, but the note didn't leave much room for argument. My options were limited, and I wasn't about to stay here waiting for the shadows to find me again. I turned back toward the horizon, key in hand. After several steps, I noticed something glimmering up ahead. At first, I thought it might be another trick of my exhausted mind, but as I drew closer, the shape of a door began to take form. It was completely out of place. A tall wooden door stood upright in the middle of the road, disconnected from any frame or wall. Its surface was covered in deep scratches, and the doorknob was tarnished with age. My instincts screamed at me to stay away, but the key in my hand pulsed with warmth, urging me forward. I hesitated, fingers trembling as I fit the key into the lock. The door clicked open with an unsettling ease. A soft creak echoed as I pushed it inward, revealing only darkness on the other side. "Whatever's in there, it can't be worse than this," I whispered, trying to convince myself. I took a deep breath and stepped through. The air on the other side was heavy, filled with an oppressive silence. When I turned back, the door was gone, leaving me in total darkness. I felt for my phone, but when I turned on the flashlight, the beam didn't pierce the blackness. It was like the dark swallowed everything. Then, faintly, I heard it again, the whispers. This time, they were louder, circling me like vultures. I couldn't make out the words, but their tone was mocking, cruel. Panic set in as I turned around frantically, trying to find anything. A wall, the ground, a way out. The whispers grew into laughter, hollow and inhuman. A sharp, guttural voice suddenly cut through the chaos. "Emily, you've wandered far from home." My breath hitched as the shadows around me coalesced into a familiar shape. It was Sam, his grin wider, his eyes darker than I remembered. He stepped closer, the shadows clinging to him like living things. "This isn't fair," I stammered. You didn't read the rules," Sam interrupted, his voice smooth and cold. "You thought the road was the way out, but you've only brought yourself deeper." I wanted to speak, but my throat was dry. The shadows behind him writhed and reached toward me, their tendrils brushing my skin like ice. "What do you want from me?" I finally managed to whisper. Sam tilted his head, the smile never fading. "Want? This isn't about what I want, Emily. This is about what you've chosen. You came here, didn't you? You unlocked the door." "I didn't have a choice," I shouted, tears spilling down my cheeks. Sam leaned closer, his face inches from mine. "There's always a choice." Before I could respond, the darkness surged around me, and I felt myself being pulled backward. My screams were swallowed by the void as the shadows dragged me deeper into the abyss. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying on the side of a different road, bathed in warm sunlight. Birds chirped in the distance, and cars rushed by as if everything was normal. I sat up, disoriented but alive. In my hand was the Polaroid, but now it showed something new, an empty stretch of road with a single word scrawled across the bottom: "Run." I clutched the Polaroid in my trembling hands, staring at the single word: "Run." The bright daylight around me felt like a cruel joke, a facade of normalcy after the nightmare I'd just endured. My body ached, my mind reeled, and my heart thundered in my chest. But one thought overpowered the rest. I had to leave. I staggered to my feet, shaking off the numbness that clung to me like a second skin. The road I now stood on was unfamiliar, but it was paved, lined with sporadic traffic signs, and alive with the faint sound of cars in the distance. A flicker of hope pushed me forward. Each step was labored, but the further I walked, the more real everything began to feel. Birds sang in the trees, the faint rustle of leaves swayed in the wind, and the warmth of the sun thawed the cold dread still lingering in my bones. It was almost enough to convince me it was over, but the Polaroid in my hand pulsed with heat, faint and rhythmic like a heartbeat. I dared to look at it again. This time the image had changed. It no longer showed an empty road. Instead, it depicted a car barreling straight toward me. A car I recognized as my own. I spun around just in time to see it. My car was racing down the road, out of control, straight for me. There was no driver behind the wheel. Panic overtook me as I darted to the side, narrowly avoiding the impact. The car skidded to a halt several yards ahead, its tires screeching. The driver's side door swung open slowly, creaking on its hinges. Torn between running into the forest beside the road or investigating, my chest heaved with ragged breaths, and the instinct to flee was overwhelming. But something compelled me to move toward the car. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer, each footstep feeling like a final act. The interior of the car was empty, just as I'd suspected, but lying on the driver's seat was another Polaroid and a familiar object, the leather journal. My hands trembled as I picked them up, my skin crawling at the now familiar texture of the journal's worn cover. The Polaroid's image sent a chill through me. It showed me, standing right there by the car, holding the journal. Written at the bottom were 3 words, "This is it." I froze. The journal seemed to vibrate faintly in my grip, urging me to open it. I hesitated but flipped it open with shaky fingers. Inside, the frantic handwriting stretched across the pages, the same lines repeating over and over. "End it now. Stop running." And tears blurred my vision. I knew what it meant. There was no escaping the cycle. The road, the gas station, Sam, they weren't just events or places. They were part of something bigger, something endless, and I was trapped. But there was one choice left. I climbed into the driver's seat, clutching the Polaroid and journal. The car roared to life when I turned the key, even though I hadn't filled it with gas. The road ahead stretched out infinitely, but this time I had no destination. My fingers gripped the wheel, my knuckles white as I pressed the accelerator to the floor. The scenery blurred as I sped faster and faster, the trees bending unnaturally. The sky darkened until nothing was visible but the faint glow of headlights against the road. Whispers rose around me, a cacophony of voices blending into Sam's cold laughter. "You wanted to leave," his voice echoed in my mind, mocking and hollow. "But the road always leads back." I gritted my teeth, the speedometer climbing higher. The journal began to smolder in the passenger seat, its pages curling and blackening. The Polaroid burned hot in my hand. I didn't slow down. If the road was a trap, I'd break it. If the game was unwinnable, I'd end. With one final scream, I jerked the wheel. The car veered off the road and into the abyss beyond. The weightless sensation consumed me, the rush of wind tearing at my face, and the whispers climaxed into a deafening roar. Then, silence. When I opened my eyes, I was home. My bed, my room, everything was as I had left it before the trip. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, warm and inviting. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. Could it have all been a nightmare? But on my nightstand sat 2 things, a burned leather journal and a singed Polaroid. The image showed the gas station, the sign above it fully illuminated, its message clear and final, "Welcome back." It was late at night, and I had been driving for hours. My eyes were heavy. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and I knew I needed to stop to refuel before I ran out of gas. The nearest gas station was a small one, tucked off the highway in the middle of nowhere, almost as if it had been forgotten by time. I pulled into the station, its flickering neon lights barely cutting through the darkness. The smell of gasoline hit me instantly, overpowering the night air. The sound of my tires on the gravel was the only noise as I got out of the car. The station was old, the kind that looked like it belonged in an old horror movie, dimly lit, with rusty metal pumps that looked like they hadn't been used in years. At first, there was no one around. I glanced around the empty lot. The old building's windows were dark, and there wasn't a soul in sight. But I wasn't in the mood to question the strange silence. My body craved rest, and I needed gas to get to my next destination. I began to pump the gas, but my attention was drawn to a strange figure that appeared out of the corner of my eye. A person stood by the entrance to the station's shop. They were just standing there, unmoving. I thought I saw their eyes, those unsettling, glassy eyes staring back at me. But the moment I turned fully to look, the figure vanished behind the wall. I hesitated, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My thoughts told me I was just being paranoid, but my gut told me something wasn't right. To make matters worse, the night grew eerily quiet. Even the hum of the old neon lights seemed to fade away. My heart started to race a little faster. I quickly finished pumping the gas and turned around to return to my car. That was when I saw the old man. He had appeared out of nowhere, standing near the gas pump with a peculiar little grin on his face. His clothes were shabby, worn beyond recognition, and he looked like someone who hadn't stepped outside in years. His eyes were sunken, hollow, and his skin pale, almost as though it had never seen the light of day. "Can I help you with something, miss?" he asked, his voice a raspy whisper, as if his words were a struggle. I felt an unease creep up my spine as I quickly nodded and backed toward my car. "No thank you," I replied, trying to sound calm, but my voice quivered slightly. The man simply smiled, a twisted, unsettling smile, and didn't say anything more. I climbed into my car, locking the doors instantly, my hands shaking slightly. What was happening here? Who was this man, and why did he feel like an intruder in my nightmare? I sat in my car for a few minutes, trying to gather the courage to leave. The loneliness of the place felt suffocating, and for a moment, the thought of just driving away quickly seemed like the only logical option, but I couldn't. For some reason, I felt compelled to get out. I didn't know why. Maybe it was the darkness outside, or some force drawing me back. I didn't even realize how long I had been sitting there, looking at the lone gas station shop, until I looked up. That's when I saw something that made my heart freeze with terror. There, on the windowsill, was an old cracked doll. It wasn't there when I arrived, at least I was sure of it. But now, its beady eyes seemed to stare directly into mine. I jumped out of the car, my heart pounding loudly in my chest, and ran to the shop door, yanking it open. The bell above the door gave a shrill jingle as I entered. The shop was old and dimly lit, shelves stacked with forgotten supplies like bottles of faded soft drinks, dusty snack bags, and cans with rust around the edges. But the doll was the last thing on the counter. Its cracked porcelain skin seemed to glow eerily in the dim light. I took a deep breath. Could it be part of some sick joke or prank? I wanted to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the open door, and I looked to the left. There, standing near the back shelves, was the same old man. But this time, he wasn't smiling. He was crying. Tears rolled down his face in thick, wet streaks, but there was nothing normal about the way he cried. His body swayed like a puppet whose strings had been tangled, jerking, moving erratically with each sob. His mouth opened, but only unnatural gurgling sounds came out. Then, without warning, he raised his hands. "Run!" he shrieked, his voice hoarse and muffled, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. His eyes went wide, too wide, and then the store began to shake violently. The floor vibrated beneath me. The walls around me groaned and creaked as if the building itself were alive. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and then everything went silent. I found myself standing alone, the cold of the night creeping into my bones. The shop was gone, replaced by thick darkness that pressed in on all sides, as if swallowing me whole. Then the gas pumps outside started moving on their own, the rusted metal groaning as it jerked and twisted. It felt like everything was pulling me into it, dragging me further and further down into some dark place. I knew I wasn't alone, but what I felt wasn't just the presence of someone else. It was the presence of something else, something ancient, something that had waited for me to find it. The cold darkness swallowed me deeper, and the sense of danger became overwhelming. I felt as though the gas station, the very ground beneath me, was coming to life, closing in on me, trapping me in a nightmare I couldn't escape. I forced my legs to move, one step at a time, toward the door. I could still hear the ragged breath of the old man, the twisted sounds of his movement, but when I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing but shadows, cold, empty, hungry. Without thinking, I bolted outside. The wind slammed into me, and the world felt distorted, as if time itself was twisting, turning in on itself. The neon lights of the station flickered again, but in a sickening pattern. Each flicker was slower than the last. Everything seemed unreal. The pumps, the old car that still sat in the same spot, the doll. Everything was locked in a warped, distorted dimension where the laws of the real world didn't apply. Then I saw it. Beyond the pumps, just barely visible in the dim light, was the figure of the old man. But this time he wasn't alone. There were others with him now, standing eerily still like shadows cast from someplace beyond our world. Their faces were hollow. Their eyes, if they even had them, were empty sockets, and their mouths stretched into ghastly grins. I stumbled back, nearly falling on the uneven ground. My car. I had to get to my car. But before I could make a move, The world around me started to distort again. I could feel the very ground shift beneath my feet, as if the station was trying to claim me, to pull me down into the depths of whatever darkness it held. I took a deep breath, turned on my heel, and ran. My legs screamed in protest. My lungs burned for air, but I didn't stop. I had to get out. The engine roared to life as I slammed into the driver's seat and turned the key. I couldn't remember if I had ever driven faster than that. My hands shaking as I clutched the wheel, my heart pounded like thunder as I sped away, the headlights cutting through the fog like ghosts, casting shadows of their own. I didn't look back. Hours passed, but I didn't stop. Not for another gas station, not for a place to rest, nothing. My eyes were trained on the road, my hands frozen on the steering wheel. I didn't dare sleep, didn't dare look away for even a second. Something about that place, the gas station, was still with me, lurking in the corners of my mind, just beyond my vision. I found a motel sometime in the early morning, though I hadn't remembered the drive. As soon as I stepped inside the room, I felt the weight of exhaustion crushing down on me. For the first time that night, I allowed myself to close my eyes. But even as I drifted into a light sleep, I heard it. The faint sound of footsteps echoing from somewhere far away, from somewhere beyond this world. And with that sound, I knew one thing for certain: I had not escaped. The gas station was still there, waiting, watching. It was only a matter of time before it would come for me again.